Something that always sticks with me when playing Resident Evil or any other horror game in general are the documents, mostly in the form of a diary entry or letter addressed to the protagonist. It's an element which elevates our experience, presenting us with a foreign viewpoint on a particular time period or setting within the game's story, bringing to life a character, while they detail an event you may or may not be supposed to read, but also adding tremendously to the atmosphere and realism, which is especially powerful in horror games. RE4 utilises the notes perfectly. They can be found through exploring the mostly linear environments, on tables, beds, nailed to walls, nailed to trees, never really out of sight unless you deliberately miss them. The majority of these will narrate the events of Leon's capture or Ashley's kidnapping from the perspective of the three main antagonists. However, there's a small number of notes which I can only describe as disturbing, those that are either unnerving to read, are found in strange locations, or have disturbing imagery assigned to them. In this video, I want to rank the top 5 most disturbing documents in RE4, and I'll be using 3 main points as the criteria. The first of these is the artwork, how disturbing the images are in their respective notes. Some longer documents actually have multiple images as you scroll through them, and will all be considered for the rating. The second is the context, essentially the terminology of the letter and its presentation, the location, and its author. Lastly, I've included an overall disturbing rating, encompassing the previous 2 features as merit, as well as any underlying characteristics which boost its overall atmosphere. This is another biased input, obviously, a subjective list which speaks to me personally, so please feel free to mention any notes that you find disturbing because I'm always interested in hearing your opinion. Starting off the list, we have a rather tragic backstory involving what I strongly assume to be Salazar's left hand, a poetic foreshadowing of his death where he's fused together with Salazar during the castle's final boss fight. The document details the circumstances regarding Salazar's assimilation with the Las Plagas, under heavy manipulation by Sadler. Unlike Mendez, Salazar's actions are contradictory to his personality, and it's hinted at that he was partially aware of Sadler's plan, yet didn't want anything to do with it. He was probably forced against his will to undergo transfusion, similarly to the villagers. I actually loved this letter. It's my second favourite in the game, minus the number 2 spot on the list. The fact that it makes me sympathise with Salazar amidst his continuous attempts to kill us at every opportunity. It's not really him at all. The real Salazar would have been someone completely different. The artwork in this letter is the high point. The sheer mystery and atmosphere presented in one image is what really makes it the 5th most disturbing document in RE4. The shadow casting over Salazar's face, representing the deteriorated state that he's in by this point, as well as the butler's unconditional faith in him as a person. The monocle and the notebook adding to the personality. The faintly lit desk making it all seem more relaxing, yet eerie at the same time. I much prefer the letters which are congruent throughout, those without multiple other shots breaking the ambience created by a beautifully constructed art piece such as this desk, while you immerse yourself into the letter as if you're there reading it. Although not the most disturbing, the letter is still upsetting to dissect, and is elevated further when we discover more about the game later on, in the end credits, and when we prove the butler's suspicions correct after confronting Sadler.
I hate to break it out to you, but Salazar's dead.
Yes, it seems that way.
Sadler, why don't you give up and let Ashley go home?
Perhaps you are disillusioned with overconfidence, just because you killed my small-time subordinate.
I suppose it's more about the character dynamics and the mystery of who the butler is that makes this letter as memorable as it is. Finding this document as Ashley makes it more unique in a sense, taking place in the only part of the game where you feel absolutely defenseless and the most vulnerable. I'll add more points to its overall rating just for that. Overall, there isn't any other letter in the game that I find myself absorbed in as much as the Butler's Memo. It's more than deserving of the number 5 spot on this list. Let me know if you'd like to see a more in-depth video about the Butler, because I think it's a mystery that deserves further evaluation. Our mission is the final document that you'll encounter in the game, located near the merchant's desk and directly before the final boss. The letter details Sadler's apocalyptic objectives, his reasoning for kidnapping Ashley, to install widespread chaos onto the American people, as well as his intentions to take over the rest of the world by extension. I find anything regarding war as automatically creepy. Emergency alerts, civil defense sirens. I'm sure some of you are aware of analog horror. I think emergency alert system mock scenarios are some of the most disturbing of these, and for good reason. The amount of power that comes through this document makes it comparable to a declaration of a world war. Unlike the Butler's Memo, the artwork style is much more serious, displaying multiple photographs of American politicians at an assembly of some sort. A very realistic and communal setting to give a sense of urgency. The person on the right's face is heavily distorted. It makes the whole image look uncanny, like something you'd see in a dream or an AI image. Honestly, the less I talk about it, the better. It's just a strange document overall, and I hate how unintentionally disturbing it is. The faces, how out of place this letter is compared to everything else in the game, the last sentence bringing everything together. Once again, the placement of the letter and the artwork influence the rating immensely. I think my personal distaste of this letter is what makes it number 4 on the list. I can barely stand to look at it without feeling uneasy.
To demonstrate to the whole world our astounding power, of course. No longer will the United States think they can police the world forever. So, we kidnapped the president's daughter in order to give her our power.
Coming in at number 3, we have one of Lewis's memos, which can be discovered nearing the excavation site beneath the castle. The letter goes into great detail surrounding the birth of Las Plagas and Los Illuminatos' re-establishment, and is the most important letter in the game from a lore perspective. We learn all about the fossilization of the Plagas, how they remained alive during those long years, waiting to be discovered, and that the Granados were the first to inhale their spores, which led to the outbreak in the village. We also know that Salazar was the one who discovered these remains and subsequently ordered their excavation in the first place. When referring to the Butler's Memo, we know that Salazar was against Sadler's plan, so during this time period he would have had to have been infected already, but without the dominant species Plagas, or he was blackmailed by Sadler in some other way. Sadler can't control the hosts of the dominant species Plagas. This includes Krauser, Mendez and Salazar. So either the Butler was wrong about Salazar and he was evil all along, or Sadler did something to turn him around, maybe a topic for another mystery video. The artwork is the first in the list to feature 2 frames instead of 1, both showing Las Plagas in a dormant state and rigorously latching onto a ganado respectively. Finally, we have a traditionally scary depiction this far into the list, using dead expressions and exaggerated emotion to express a type of horror that we're at least familiar with. Again, I love the attention to detail here, and the lighting shares a similar vibe to the Butler's Memo. It's enough to cast a visualization of the image, clearly enough, whilst setting a tone for the reader. To contradict my original point, when the 2 shots better establish the story and aren't misplaced, I wouldn't consider them as detrimental to the overall atmosphere. The length and value of this letter warrants this, actually. The same applies for all of Lewis's memos. He is the best character after all. Going through the language, you start to hear the realization in Lewis's voice as he comes to terms with Sadler as a person. Bear in mind, he wrote these memos whilst infected, long before Leon arrived in Spain. Uncovering things like this are probably what changed his opinion on the Illuminatos while he was still researching under Sadler. He was looking for a way out at this point. I thoroughly enjoy reading any of Lewis's notes when replaying RE4, and the disturbing nature of these images and uncovering the secret of Las Plagas' origin are what makes it one of the most chilling documents in the game. The ganado on the left side of the second shot is the high point for me. It reminds me of the first zombie encounters of Resident Evil 1. And the fact that Lewis himself wrote it makes it abundantly clear as to his placement on the list, despite its length and lack of a deterrent. Numbers 1 and 2 make you dread ever coming across its subject matter, the only two letters that will terrify you after you've finished reading them. I was extremely close from putting this at number 1 out of personal bias, but after contemplating the two for a while, I just couldn't do it, unfortunately. It actually doesn't even come close, which is funny because number 3 doesn't come close to this one either. These two are on another level, and would hold up on an expanded list where I involve notes spanning across the entire series. Regardless, this one remains as my favourite in the game, with the Butler's Memo being number 2 as previously mentioned. The letter is the last of many from the first major boss fight of the game, Chief Mendez. Upon diminishing optimism and whittling down his answers, he comes to the conclusion that Leon is too strong for the villagers and decides to take matters into his own hands. He knew that the ambush wouldn't work because it's the only instance where he forges a backup plan in the same document to wait for you at the Enlightenment cabin, for only his sight will open the main gate. It also briefly mentions Leon's infection, as well as the primary motive being to apprehend Lewis. The real magic of this letter comes from its one and only illustration, the cabin in a saturated black and white photograph. This image wouldn't feel out of place as one of the many paintings lining the house walls of the village, including Mendez's house. To be honest, I much prefer this one. It's just so depressed and degraded, possibly representing Mendez's desperation and loss of hope. It's the only picture on the list to feature a building that we're obviously supposed to come across at one point and prepare for. The descent through the cliffs down into the lowermost point of the village, with an optional visit to the execution grounds where Ada was held. You know that the cabin is close, but you aren't exactly sure where it is or how long it will take to get there. Leon hints at the letter while asking Ashley to hide. He wouldn't have done this if he wasn't using the letter for reference. He simply wouldn't have known any better. This photograph involuntarily saved Ashley's life.
You better stay outside. Ashley, go hide.
Yeah.
I think this one speaks for itself. I love how it's the last letter that Mendez leaves us as a call to arms, a last-ditched effort to save the village and stop our efforts to enter the castle grounds. The art is literally perfect, and the long-lasting effect that this document has makes it one of the most memorable in the game all these years later. I think it's a great candidate for the number 2 spot. I don't think anyone is surprised that Lewis's Memo 3 is without a doubt the most disturbing document in the game, and one of the most disturbing in the series. It's the one that people who don't even really pay attention to the letters can remember word for word, and where people who've never played the game would recognise it. Located in the operating theatre, it serves as our introduction to the Regenerators, giving a detailed account of their biology, their weaknesses and abilities. You can sense the shock coming through Lewis's report as it's read, using the phrase, "I've never seen anything like it." Bear in mind, this was presumably after his research on the excavation of Las Plagas, as well as his discovery of many other creatures such as the El Gigante and the Novistadors. The Regenerators are another beast entirely. They are also byproducts of experimentation, but possess human characteristics. The people that were subject to this transfusion could still be present, but like the Ganados are controlled by Las Plagas to a more powerful extent, leaving only their distinct breathing as their only means of communication. The photos are just, yeah, I mean, if I could give whatever this is an 11 out of 10 for disturbing, I would. Why is it smiling? I think the one on the left is supposed to be the one we find in the prison near the end of the game. You can see the metal bars in the foreground. Perhaps this one is more important than the rest, being that it's the only regenerator located outside the grounds of the hospital. I love the theme of black and white illustrations, reminiscent of the time period where this game was set, but also giving an antiquated vibe that adds a lot of atmosphere. For the sake of continuity, most documents do feature these in order to keep our eyes focused on the writing, and it's a great touch. In summary, Luce's Memo 3 is the definition of a disturbing note. From the art, to the language, to the location, I think it's very hard to argue that anything comes close. Even when researching every other note in the game, I've always had this as number 1 for obvious reasons. The letters in Resident Evil aren't as well implemented anymore in my opinion. I loved the older games where the whole screen would transition into an engaging piece of art for us to absorb ourselves into. I don't think they're considered important enough to be presented with as much detail as the original RE4 did back in 2005, or both versions of RE1 for example. Many people, including myself, loved these disturbing documents. The Keeper's Diary in RE1 was literally the scariest thing I have ever read. It was incredible, and I'd love for newer games to try and replicate this.